Hey Radicals, quick reminder as I begin today's podcast that tickets are on sale now for Radical Family Camp 2025, our second annual version of Radical Personal Finance Family Camp. If you would like to come hang out with me, my family, and a couple hundred of our radical friends in April of this year in Indiana, April 10 to 13 in Indiana, please come to radicalfamilycamp.com. Get information there on the event and buy your tickets today. I put these tickets on sale on Friday. We are now 58% sold out, so I hope that this will sell out fully in a week or two. And once this sells out, I'm done. I've rented the entire camp. I don't have any space left when this is done, so this is not a sales tactic or, hey, we're going to increase it. Just go to radicalfamilycamp.com, buy your tickets today. I hope that you'll come and hang out with me for a beautiful 4-day weekend. We're going to talk about community and dynasty, how to build community and how to build your personal dynasty. Welcome to Radical Personal Finance, a show dedicated to providing you with the knowledge, skills, insight, and encouragement you need to live a rich and meaningful life now while building a plan for financial freedom in 10 years or less. My name is Joshua Sheets. I'm your host, and today on the show, I would like to revisit a theme that I've been talking about for a decade, but seriously for at least 6 years. In March of 2019, I released episodes 628 and 629 of the podcast. Those episodes were titled Federal Debt, the Ticking Bomb That No One is Willing to Defuse. And in that series of podcasts, I discussed some of the details of U.S. federal debt, basically the constant and growing deficits that the U.S. government faces, the burgeoning and ballooning federal debt that is growing, and what would be necessary in order to actually change some of the situation. In that podcast, I shared a piece that was written by Brian Riedel with the Manhattan Institute, and it was a very good and sober and sensible discussion of federal debt, where he went through and laid out some of the details of specifically what kinds of changes would be needed in order to basically freeze the debt at about 100% of annual GDP. So this does not involve actually paying off the national debt. It just simply involves making some changes at the margins that would be necessary in order to actually freeze things. So, okay, it's bad. Think of it like a household, that it's bad. We're heavily indebted, but we can make our payments and we're not getting worse. That's the basic idea. Now, I may touch on a few of those figures, but basically, when you discuss and research the question carefully, what you see is that in order to make progress on this issue, there's going to have to be a broad array of measures brought to bear. And it's not sufficient with any kind of projections. It's not sufficient to give in to either right-wing fantasies or left-wing fantasies. So it's not sufficient to say, we can just tax the rich. Even if you look at taxing the rich, what you discover is, well, even if we tax the rich enormously, it doesn't change much. So, for example, if you were to take away every dollar of income that wealthy income earners in the United States earn over $1 million, then you would collect 3.8% of GDP, which would not even balance the long-term budget. If you seized every dollar of wealth from America's billionaires, every single thing that they own, every home, car, business, and investment, you would succeed in funding the federal government one time for a total of 9 months. So you can look at things like taxing the rich, and you can say, well, obviously that's not going to be sufficient to actually solve the problem. And so you can go through and recognize and look at different new taxes that could be passed, new taxes that could make an impact on the population. And what you discover is that, okay, we need to raise taxes very, very substantially just to get to the point of freezing GDP. And so that would be kind of the left-wing fantasy. On the right-wing fantasy, you would have the idea, well, we can just grow our way out of it, right? If we can just change the economy and increase growth rates, then what would happen is we would be able to have so much more growth in the economy and so much more tax revenue raised by that we would have amazing growth and we would be able to freeze the federal debt and pay it off just through economic growth. And when you look at this, you say, okay, well, what if we actually did it? So if you actually look at the numbers, then you would say, well, first of all, where is the growth going to come from? So we have, of course, the problems of an aging population, meaning we have the baby boomers that are getting close to fully retired, but massively retiring. Consumption is down by them. We don't have enough children, enough young people to grow the economy. So you could say, well, you could go back to the highest growth rates in the United States in history, which came after World War II. And that was, again, driven by a demographic boom, an enormous demographic boom. But we have exactly the opposite problem today. We have a demographic bust. The big problem that we have is depopulation all around the world, all across the United States. The United States is one of the least bad major countries in the world, but it's still bad. And so you say, well, let's do it with productivity. Well, if you look at productivity, you see that the numbers are still very, 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 very small. The Congressional Budget Office, for example, projects in general that productivity growth is going to average a little bit more than 1%. That's about what it has averaged over the last 3 decades. And so if you increase that by 50% from 1.1% to 1.6%, then you could see that that would cut off about 44% of the projected debt growth within 3 decades. The debt would still keep growing to unsustainable levels, but it would push it off for a slightly later time. And so economic growth is obviously good and helpful, but when you project the data, it's simply not possible to grow your way out of it. And so you can go across the range on every single issue. And what you see is that if the United States is likely to arrest its burgeoning, ballooning deficits and stop the growth of the federal debt, it's probably going to be a broad series of packages that really will make nobody happy and really are going to anger almost everyone. And so what I said in 2019 is, here's what the data is, here's what you need to look for in order to see if things are going to change. In order to see, you need to see some ability for Congress in the United States to come together and to pass a series of new laws and policies that are pretty much going to make everybody unhappy. You're going to have probably significant tax increases. You're going to have probably significant cuts to spending. Nobody's going to be happy about what gets cut, but you're going to have broad-based agreement that, hey, if we're going to fix this, then we're going to have to deal with this unpleasantness. And in many ways, this would be similar or analogous to how you and I, as hopefully mature and thoughtful people, if we come into a budget in a household where the finances are just in terrible shape, then even though we don't like cutting expenditures, even though we don't like saying, no, you can't consume at this high level, we have to do that. And so typically when a household is in bad financial shape, you come in and you bring in a whole bunch of policies that are really unpleasant. You say you've got to work more, you've got to go get paid more, and you got to work a lot more hours. Everyone needs extra jobs. You got to cut spending. No one's having fun. Everyone's miserable, but that's what's necessary generally in order to make progress. And I said in 2019, here's what you need to be looking for, is this broad, bipartisan, serious commitment to a broad set of policies that are really going to make everyone unhappy. If we don't see that, then we should expect the U.S. government to default on its debt in some way or another. And my basic operating mindset for the last decade has been that ultimately the U.S. government is going to default on its debt. Now, default doesn't necessarily just mean just not going to pay anything. Default can mean a lot of different things. It can mean inflating the debt away. So I've expected mass inflation in the United States for a long period of time because that's a useful tool to basically inflate away the debt. It can mean not delivering services as agreed. And so you see this happening in many places over the years. Years ago, I did a podcast on the state of Maine and Medicaid recipients in the state of Maine who are receiving full benefits from Medicaid. Medicaid is happy to step up and pay for the cost of care according to the terms of Medicaid. But the state of Maine simply doesn't have the number of necessary workers that are necessary in order to facilitate actual medical care being delivered to those who need it most. The workers aren't there. So the people who in theory should be receiving the benefits, they literally can't because there aren't people there in Maine who are able to actually pay. And this is a huge demographic problem. So that was an example of a default. And so you can go through almost any government program, and you can imagine a dozen different ways that this program can be defaulted on that doesn't necessarily look like a headline news that the U.S. doesn't make payments on the interest on the national debt. So this is basically where the situation has been. And for the last 10 years, I have been hopeless on the subject. Now, that's not an emotional thing. I just have observed that this is unsolvable. Nobody is serious about it. So you and I should make our plans going forward as though default is basically inevitable. And that would be the responsible approach, is to assume that default is inevitable. And unless we see something different, just let's press forward. Now, because these things are so long moving, though, it's easy to lose track of it, lose sight of it. And so the topic that I want to just address briefly is there reason for hope? In the news quite vigorously ever since the election and the inauguration of President Trump, we have had the newly renamed Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE or DOGE, which is it is absolutely hilarious. One thing I appreciate about the modern world is that many of our leaders are willing just to lean into the humor and the irony and the ridiculousness of having fun with serious topics. A quick bit of history for you on why I laugh at the name Doge. I think many in my audience would understand this, but perhaps a few are not as plugged in as others. So the idea of Doge goes back to a meme, an internet meme that became popular in 2013. And in essence, it was a meme that showed a dog. The specific breed of dog is something called a Shiba Inu dog. Very cute, very fluffy, beautiful dog. And this became an internet meme that people would, again, manipulate, put text on, and do all kinds of interesting, fun things. So then along the way, around that time, as Bitcoin had come to prominency and then other coins were coming along, then a couple of software engineers named Billy Marcus and Jackson Palmer decided that they were going to create a fake coin that was specifically created to be entirely, completely fake as a way of making fun of how stupid all of the online crypto coins were, all the different coins and meme coins that people were doing. So they launched this meme coin, and they specifically had the idea that we're going to make this stupid joke as a way to show that everybody can create everybody can create a cryptocurrency, and there's nothing that is happening from it. It's just a totally fake thing. So that started in 2013. Well, along the way, people started to buy it and they started to sell it. And you had all these funny things that happened, and the coin continued to grow and continued to grow, and it increased its value, and it wound up having a market capitalization of billions of dollars. And then along the way, more and more people started to get involved in it. And it's one of these things where it became so ridiculous that more people just jumped into it as a joke. Now, a lot of stuff happened in the 2020 and 2021 where all the GameStop stuff that was happening. Elon Musk got involved, and Elon Musk purchased a bunch of Dogecoin. Various people, I think Mark Cuban started taking Dogecoin as payment for tickets, and this coin just continued to grow. And so it was absurd, because here you have a coin that was created, a cryptocurrency that was created as a joke to basically demonstrate how stupid and foolish the whole market was, and to make fun of Bitcoin and people trying to use coins like that. And yet the coin itself became adopted widely and has continued to be broadly owned, broadly used. I don't know. I don't follow that market, but it's continued to be funny and in demand. So along the way, politically speaking, when Elon Musk started to get involved with the Trump campaign and started to lobby for the idea of a Department of Government Efficiency. It was named DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, as being related to the joke. And that's when I first figured it out, I could not believe it. This is hilarious that life imitates art. It's so funny that Elon Musk, who was famous for this controversy about the Dogecoin and him holding millions of dollars of Dogecoin, is now leading the Department of Government Efficiency called DOGE. It's hilarious. I love it. I love it. But the question is DOGE actually doing any good? Is there a reason to hope? Well, my answer is yes. I am hopeful. I'm optimistic. Now, I'm optimistic because I've decided to be optimistic, not because I overestimate what the Department of Government Efficiency may be able to accomplish. If you look at the chaos over the last couple of weeks of just tiny little changes and tiny little things happening, then there's good reason to believe that this entire thing is going to end in catastrophe, absolute catastrophe, because so far the actual savings of canceled contracts, lowered expenses, and things like that, the actual savings have been minuscule in terms of their actual impact to and their ability to affect the overall fiscal situation of the U.S. government. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars, billions here and there when we're dealing with trillions that are needed. But I am cautiously optimistic. I'm hopeful that this is basically just the starting point, and that makes me hope that, okay, maybe we can actually make progress on this thing. On the whole, I think on the whole, politicians can't do very much in reality. But what they can do is they can launch a conversation. They can launch a movement that could result in significant changes. And over the years, as I have watched President Trump, it seems like that is one of his superpowers. One of his superpowers is basically being able to listen to various issues and then insert himself into the middle of a conversation, a controversy of some kind, and basically show how important it is and get people talking about it. And you see him do this again and again and again. And so the fact that the Department of Government Efficiency has all of this press with it right now and just vicious fighting and vicious political back and forth, to me is enormously encouraging, because all of this is shining a very bright light on the topic of government finances. And whenever you have this kind of controversy, then everyone who's a content creator wants to be part of the controversy. And so you have people that experts are brought in on a cable news show or on a podcast, and it gets talked about. I'm talking about this subject here again with you. And so awareness is being raised in the culture, and any kind of awareness that can be raised about government excess, government fraud, government waste is really, really important. And the fact that Elon Musk is out front talking about the necessity of making big changes so that the government doesn't default on its debt is enormously encouraging. He has a very healthy bully pulpit, and so his ability to speak to these issues is really good to wake people up. I think he's done an enormous good in talking about these issues and talking about the necessity of making changes so the U.S. government doesn't default on its debt. I think he's done enormous good in talking about the importance of birth rates and demographic collapse. And so he's been consistent for at least 5 years, I would guess. That is probably the first time I heard him start talking about the subject, talking about the impacts of demographic collapse and how this is humanity's greatest risk, and it's a much bigger risk than global warming and so on, continually. And so these are good trends. And I'm hopeful that he is smart enough and that he has a strategy and a plan about what he's doing. Take a moment and recall the essay that I read recently on radical personal finance, the essay that was describing the experiences of Vinay Hiremath, who was a co-founder of the company Loom, which was acquired for $1 billion, almost $1 billion. So after making a lot of money in the sale of his company, he's trying to figure out, okay, what do I do with my life? And he shared about how one of the things that he considered doing was going and working at DOGE. And it was really interesting. He said he was thrust right in the middle of some of the smartest people, most aggressive people that he was involved in. So I think the positive case that we could make is that Elon Musk, who is well known for his ability to basically cut to the heart of a problem, to the very core of a problem, that he got together with some of the smartest people that he could find, and they said, how can we fix government waste, government inefficiency, and government fraud? And so right after the inauguration of President Trump, they trot right into the office of, was it OMB, the Office of Management and Budgets, right into the central place where all the money is going through, and they collect all the data and they start going through it and scraping through it. And it seems very, 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 very intelligent. If you read some of the essays that people have written about where this legislation came from, basically they repurposed a department that was set up under former President Barack Obama. And so they have strong legal justification for it, strong legal protection for this. All the executive did in this case was basically repurpose a previous branch and fill it with new people with a new focus and a new effort. And so that's really encouraging. And so perhaps, again, the positive side would say perhaps they're going through and starting at the small stuff that's relatively easy, right? Cutting out fraud, cutting out waste, canceling a bunch of contracts that are unnecessary, and they're learning and kind of iterating, and then they'll be able to press on to the big stuff. That's what I'm hoping is the case, that they're just going through finding fraud, finding waste, finding all kinds of things that can be cut out. Now, what's the other side of it? Of course, you could take the hardcore side that these people are messing with the money and Elon Musk is going to steal your Social Security numbers, and the USAID is the world's most important, agency that everyone should be supporting, and yada, yada, yada. I don't know. I don't have any idea. I don't buy any of that stuff. I think that you got a bunch of crooks and hooligans that have had their funding exposed, and all of a sudden you realize that they have been sucking on the government teat for a very long time, and now things are in trouble. And my heart hurts for a lot of the people who are exposed to that, because while certainly many people who are impacted by this change are many of them are scoundrels, and you're glad to see them lose their money, but many of them are not. And so I always feel significant pain and empathy with people who face difficult circumstances and all of that. But on the whole, I'm hopeful. And what I would say, what can we do? Where can we see? Well, number one, we can watch and see. And there's not really much of anything that can be done now other than call your congressman and try to encourage things to keep going. Feel free to get scandalized at the fraud and the abuse. I think looking at USAID contracts has been very, very helpful to radicalize people and recognize, wait a second, why are we doing this? What's going on? And I'm certain that some of it is smart. Again, I'm not an extremist on this stuff. I try not to be anyway. I try to say, listen, let's be sensible. But it just seems like when you are awash in sensibility, you basically make no progress on anything. And it's been interesting to me to watch and analyze even just the current political situation. My entire adult life, I've been a political junkie since I was in my teens. My entire adult life, all I ever saw was the people on my side of the aisle make grand promises and then renege on every single one of them. And so Republicans would go on, blah, blah, blah. We're going to lower the debt. We're going to reduce the deficit. And then they go in and they come out of office and things are worse than ever. And ironically, over the years, the best fiscal performance of the U.S. government has happened under Democratic administrations. So Bill Clinton famously balanced the budget. I remember that. I didn't understand what that was when I was in high school, and Bill Clinton balanced the budget, and all of a sudden, look, we got all kinds of extra money. So they quickly came up with ways to spend it. And then of the modern day, I haven't looked to see the numbers as they stood under former President Biden, but former President Obama was one of the best, most fiscally conservative presidents of the modern age. I don't think that's because he wanted to be. I think it's just that the Republicans were so good in their position at that time as the opposition, And so he was basically stymied at various turns. And when the Republicans were in a place of opposition, opposing the Democratic president, then you wound up with gridlock, and gridlock was good for the debt. It's so ironic. So we'll see. I hope, but I'm certainly been traumatized enough times by Republicans who don't ever actually make any progress on anything. They talk big and they don't make any progress on anything, that I certainly am not going to plan my future on it. But I'm hoping that perhaps this could be a change. Regardless, we face enormous issues. And while the current chaos and arguments and things like that are no fun, they're certainly necessary. And my hope is that we can use this as a way of basically fighting through and finding a new path forward. I continue to operate from the basic mindset of what I learned from George Friedman's book called The Storm Before the Calm. And Friedman's thesis was that in the United States, you have a very long-range political cycle and economic cycle. And in the political cycles, 3 times the U.S. government has had to go through and reinvent its political systems. I think it was 3, and now we're on the 4th time. And the similar thing with the economic system. And usually these cycles flow from different levels at different times, but this time they are coming together. His predictions are that the 2020s in the United States are a decade in which the country has to invent a completely new political system, and the country has to invent a completely new economic system. And that the 2020s, due to the difficulty of that invention, or that reinvention, would be filled with turmoil and chaos and strife, but then on the other side is another golden era. Now, I don't know how to judge the validity of kind of cyclical analysis, but his arguments made sense to me, and so far that fits what I see with my own eyes. And I understand it in a way I never did before, that the U.S. is inventing a whole new political system. You see that with a complete realignment and collapse of former political coalitions and completely new political coalitions with new issues. And you see that possibly with a new economic system, with a collapse of the old ways and a reinvention of the entire system. So I'm cautiously optimistic that while this is enormously painful, we'll see. We'll see. On the whole, I think what you and I should do is simply do our best to vote for people that we think will bring the changes that are relevant, and then sit back and let them work. I'm not going to spend my time following the day's events of DOGE or any of the other changes. I'm impressed so far. President Trump's, a lot of his work has been way better than I ever thought it would be. I don't know what drugs they're giving him in the morning to keep him relatively calm and sane compared to President Trump version 1.0, but I'm happy with it. If he could have just kept himself off of Twitter in the first administration, and things would have been so much better. So this time around, through whatever reason, he's been far more restrained than I ever expected him to be, and so I'll take it. Hopefully we can move things in the right direction. On the whole, though, these are very big issues. And so my hope is that DOGE is simply the starting point, and I hope that they can go on from here. But we have very, 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 very big cuts that need to be made to spending, and very, very, very substantial changes that need to be made on the side of revenue in order to have any hope of stabilizing the national debt and in any way. But the fact that it is being talked about publicly, the fact that Elon Musk is talking about, hey, we can cut the deficit by $1 trillion. Whether he can or can't, don't know. I hope, and I'm on his team. I want to support him in every way I can. But just the talking about it is a good move, and that's way more than we have had for a very long time. So we'll see what happens. At the end of the day, it's results that count. But I'm certainly more encouraged than I have been in a decade, in the hopes that perhaps, if something can be done, then perhaps something will happen. But in order to do that, you're going to need a lot more than just the executive branch on board. You're going to need the executive and the legislative branch working together. And that's ultimately going to be the true test of President Trump's effectiveness. He can sign all the executive orders he wants, and he can get all the headlines that he wants from that. But if he can't follow through and actually get Congress to act and get Congress lined up and moving together, then the victories are more ephemeral than desired. And so I'm hoping that he knows that, right? He's a smart guy. He knows that. His team knows that. So hopefully that can happen. But you and I could just wait and see. But let's be grateful that at least people are talking about these issues. My final comment is this. If you are not an American, or even if you are, just here's what you need to know about American society. We are a deeply, deeply violent people. And I don't mean that as a way of dismissing Americans, and I don't mean it as a moral judgment. What I mean is that our culture is fundamentally violent. And what that means is that we argue like crazy. We debate things like crazy. We commit physical violence like crazy. And that's part of who we are, right? We're the misfits of the world that basically went and pursued opportunity when everyone else stayed home and rolled around in ease and luxury. And our entire cultural story is one that involves violence, and we applaud people who break things and fix things. And so what that means is that politics in the United States are very loud, very ugly, very messy, very violent. Normally, the violence is restrained to verbal violence, but there's been many times in American history where the violence has been on the streets. I mean, the most recent example, it had a pretty calm 50 years, but go back to the 1970s and look at the political violence. You had thousands of bombs being set off all across the country, people bombing their political opponents nonstop. And so the last 50 years really have been an aberration in American history. And it's completely historically normal for presidential administrations to argue nonstop with the judicial branch and to fight with the legislators and across the board. So, but on the whole, that seems to be really productive in American society. That Americans tend to argue a lot, really loudly about stuff. But in that argument, you wind up finding new solutions, new ways of going about it. And then something happens and the argument kind of calms down and dies down and people move on. And the society moves on with this kind of strange unity that is hard to understand for many people around. And so Americans tend to argue very violently with their words and yet be able to move to unity. It's almost like a family or perhaps a relationship where that family is very loud, they argue constantly, and yet they move together. And the fact that they argue and are loud actually moves things to happen, where there's actually things that are exposed. So that's what I'm hoping for. Could be wrong, but that's what I'm hoping for. So on the whole, I'm optimistic. We need it. If huge changes do not happen, then we've got enormous problems. And so huge changes need to happen. And what I would say is buckle your seatbelts, because the arguments of the last month of the relatively small things that have happened have been very, very, this is just the tip of the iceberg. So perhaps it's good that these arguments are being had on these things that there's not a lot of support for, because when we get to the really difficult stuff, when you get to the military spending, when you get to tax policy, when we get to welfare programs and entitlement programs, we're going to have very, very significant challenges there. So time will tell. That's all I want to say. Hope it's useful and encouraging. We're all in it together. Let's watch and see what happens. Let's pray for our leaders that God would give them wisdom. Let's be those who try to bring peace and a voice of reason where possible and not bring unnecessary heat to the situation. But big changes need to happen. Otherwise, we're going to be in a much more difficult situation. And I'm hoping that that message will get through to the American government and to the American people, and that we can make those changes here and now, where they are less painful and less destructive than they would be if we didn't have that argument now and they just piled up for a decade from now. Time will tell. Quick reminder as we close, remember that tickets are on sale right now for Radical Family Camp. I launched this on Friday, Radical Family Camp 2025. Tickets are 58% sold out. I would love to have you join me. You can do that by going to Radical Family Camp and sign up today. I would expect these tickets to be gone within a week or two. I hope they are. So if you're interested in coming to Radical Family Camp, go to radicalfamilycamp.com. Come hang out with me, my family, and a few hundred of my radical friends. You can find all the details of that event at radicalfamilycamp.com.